Good afternoon. I want to start by saying that this virtual program has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in these programs do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So hello and welcome to the Frickart Reference Library's Research Tool Series on Zotero. This is the second of 4 sessions, and we will focus on features and strategies that will help build and organize your Zotero library. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And know that this session is a great introduction to the tool, but we will not touch on all aspects of Zotero, such as citations, bibliographies, or sharing. Those will be covered in future sessions, sessions 3 and session 4 to be exact. My name is Ralph Baylor. I am the Interlibrary Loan Lead at the Frickart Reference Library and the Frick Collection. Assisting me is my colleague Eugenie, who will introduce herself now so you can recognize the sound of her voice.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eugenie Fortier. I'm a reference assistant at the Frickart Reference Library. Welcome.
So let's look at today's schedule. We're going to cover the goals that we hope to meet in today's introduction. Then we'll cover how to build a library using Zotero. And then once we have a good understanding of how to build that library, we'll cover how to organize it. There are a couple of tools that Zotero offers to help you with organization. Finally, we'll cover how to search, sort, and create reports from those references that you've added and organized into your Zotero library. And then we'll open up the session for questions. By the end of today, I will hope that you'll be able to learn how to build your library and learn how to organize your library. And those first two goals, to meet those first 2 goals, we will review relevant content from last week's session, but look a little deeper into those features that we covered. For the last 2 goals, reviewing strategies for file storage management and learning how to search and sort references and generate reports, we're going to cover through demonstrations of new content that we didn't cover in the first session. So let's look first how to build your library by reviewing how to add records into the Zotero software that you might have already installed on your computer. Then we'll show you how to add files such as PDFs and images into Zotero. Now, Zotero is able to extract important metadata from many of the PDFs that you add, easily creating a reference for you to use, and I'll demonstrate how to do this. Finally, we will review the difference between the 2 types of storage Zotero offers and come up with solutions for maximizing the available amount of free storage offered to you. So a lot of this will be review from last week. It'll go by a little bit quicker than last week because we are only covering one aspect of Zotero today. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we're looking at adding references in Zotero. And you'll recall that the Zotero connector button that was installed onto your web browser is really the most convenient way of getting references onto Zotero, at least references that have that high quality metadata that you want. What I mean by metadata is the information that's in this info pane right here on the right-hand side. So let's look at how that's done. And by the way, if for whatever reason the Zotero connector did not install on your web browser, you can always go to zotero.org, and under the download tool, you can see install. Here it says the Chrome connector because I am using Google Chrome, and that's what I'll be using for today's exercises. But you can use Firefox, and it'll recognize Firefox as well. So last week we did a lot of examples with Piero della Francesca and adding references there. This week I'm going to use Caravaggio, slightly different, still Italian. We can search for Caravaggio in the Frickart Reference Library's catalog and begin to add some records. Say if I click on this book and I want this as a reference stored in my Zotero library, the connector is right here, and the connector is dynamic, so it can recognize certain types of items. So it does know that this is a book. If I click on this, it brings out this drop-down menu. If I click on the drop-down button, I have some options. Right now it's saving to my library, but I can save it to a specific collection within my library, and we'll talk more about collections later. And I can even add tags to it. As I mentioned, this is dynamic, so let's see what this looks like, how it recognizes other types of material. I actually have some items bookmarked already. So for example, this Caravaggio article, I'm just going to collect the metadata from it. I'm not going to try to collect the PDF. As you can see, it can't download the PDF automatically, and we'll talk about why in a second. But we just want to get the reference for now. And let's look at some videos. I have a list of videos from YouTube here. I'm going to refresh this. And notice that this dynamic button has now recognized this as a YouTube video. Let's go ahead and add that to my library. So what does that look like? You can see here that we have the most recent items that we added. You can tell because it says date added in this column here. And the items all have different dynamic item headings depending on the type of item it is. So here it knows that this is a journal article. If I needed to change this for any reason, for example, here, this is in all caps. I don't like that. When I make my citation, I want it to be a certain style. So I might change that, for example. I can add some extra material here. These are all editable fields. There are 3 other panes that we'll get into when we talk about organizing your library: the notes pane, tags, and related. For now, we'll just leave it on the information panel. There are other ways to add material. So you can add by an identifier, such as a DOI, which is used for journal articles, or a ISBN, using this magic wand button right here. And we can enter an ISBN. I have a book that I'm actually reading, and it's very good. And I'll just enter the ISBN and hope that it pops up. Great, there it is, Caravaggio and Life, Sacred and Profane. And again, you can add that right through here. And you can also add items manually. This works well for, let's say, primary source material that there isn't a digital equivalent for. So if you go to more, you can see I can add an artwork, an audio recording, film, journal letters, all various types of items that Zotero will recognize and will change depending on the type of item you need. And if you start with one item type and you realize this is not appropriate, just click on here and it'll ask you for a different item type. And that's how you get that information. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. One other way of getting materials onto Zotero that we have not touched on today is by a group. So here I just did a subject search for Caravaggio. And as we mentioned last week, let's say I wanted to get all the catalogs, resumes of a particular artist within my library. I just click on the subject here, and this is now a file tab. I click on that, and it's asking me which items I would like to add to my library. I'm going to select all of them in this example because it's a limited number. It's about 9. Click OK. And since they're catalog resumes, maybe I want to add a tag that says that. And I can add it straight from the connector. And if we look here, notice 2 things. One, I do have a tag that's called catalog resume. The ones in blue are the ones that you create. The ones in orange are automatic. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then there's also a tag here called catalog resumes. Well, it should be. There it is. I just needed to refresh the page. So things that you add or change in real time on that connector will be reflected in your Zotero library. Sometimes they do need to be, you need to move from one collection to the other to refresh the page. Sometimes you may have to close this out or not. That rarely happens, but just know that may be a possible solution if you're not seeing the changes that you expect to find with your references. So far we've only been storing those references in Zotero. And when I say references, I mentioned last week, but just to reiterate, that's the metadata that we pull from a record, or in the last example, the record that you create. But you can also store and access files in Zotero. So files can be stored within Zotero for easy reference if you'd like. By default, Zotero will attempt to automatically save any associated PDFs when you use the connector to save a reference. The connector will also save a snapshot of a web page from which a reference was created from. And snapshots are an offline file reflecting the state of the page that was captured at the time that the snapshot was taken. So what do I mean by that? If I go back to Zotero, for example, I have a snapshot. Attachments, by the way, in your library are indicated by a blue dot. So this tells you that there's something nested within here, or by a caret. So you can see I have a note here. A blue dot indicates a file attachment rather than a note. So you can see I have this snapshot. So I can actually see what this looked like at the time by clicking on the snapshot. So this information may have changed since then, but because I have the snapshot, I have a version captured at the time that I took it. And Zotero automatically does this. And let's see how it can automatically capture a PDF. I'm just going to go back to that journal article. Did we mention? And recall that it didn't save that PDF. There was an X. And in order to make that clear, I'm just going to go back to Zotero real quick and delete this. So if I want to delete something, I can either highlight it and drag it to trash, or I can right-click and move item to trash. Now let's go back to my record. So if I try to just download it here, the reason why it attempts to do so and it says no is because I haven't accepted the terms of service that JSTOR is offering. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and click on download PDF, accept and proceed to download, and now click on save to Zotero. And there it is. Notice that we have two records. One just contains the reference. That was that one that we tried to save and the PDF didn't download. And the other has a caret with a blue dot indicating there's a file. If I clicked on here, I get access to that PDF in full text. There you are. So any PDF you store in Zotero is stored as a copy in the Zotero data directory and will appear as the child item within a reference, as you see here. You can also copy your files onto Zotero by just dragging them. So let's say you have files on your desktop, as I do here. Let me just close out here. I can just drag this PDF, for example, in here. And you can see the PDFs here. This PDF does have metadata embedded into it. I downloaded it from the publisher. And so it immediately created a reference. This PDF right here is not from a publisher. It's not from a database. It was a scanned article. So I'm going to go ahead and download here, or rather just copy it over. And let me show you what happens. Let's expand this. And so immediately it had tried to create a reference, it couldn't, so it just leaves it as the PDF. Notice here too that these are not editable. And that's because this is not a reference, this is just a file. I'm going to want to right click and click parent item to create that reference. So now this looks similar to the journal article. It refers to this as a document because it doesn't recognize what it is. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and say this is actually a book chapter. So I might just do that. And then I would fill this out manually. So why would you want to do that? Why would you want to create a reference item and then fill this out manually? It seems like a lot of work. Well, if you do this because eventually you're going to create citations and PDF from your sources. And Zotero cannot read the PDF that you had given it. And so it won't be able to create those citations from it. It could only create citations and bibliographies from the references, not from the actual files themselves. So it's really best practice that whenever you have a PDF in Zotero and the reference isn't automatically created like it does here, to create the reference by right-clicking and then create parent item. There's already a parent item here, so it won't show up, but I can just move that to trash and do it again. Well, I'll do it a different way. Another way to do it is by clicking on this plus item and then store copy of file and then clicking on the relevant PDF. There you go. Right click. There is an option, retrieve metadata for PDF. Zotero will attempt to retrieve that metadata again, but notice you get the X saying that PDF does not contain any OCR text. So it does not know what this is. So then you'll create the parent item so that way you can tell it what it is. Let's move this whole material to the trash. So as I mentioned, it is best practice to have your files as child items with the reference as the parent item. Zotero can do those bibliographies and citations. With all that being said, in this demo underway, I'm going to take a brief segue to talk about file storage and how syncing works in Zotero. So you may recall that I shared this illustration last week in regards to syncing. You're allowed up to 300 megabytes of freestyle file storage that you can use for any type of file you may want to store in Zotero. And file storage also includes snapshots. It doesn't include information related to storing your references. So stuff like your references themselves, any notes, or any other type of metadata information. You have unlimited storage, but it does start filling up once you do have that file storage. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that I'm on my work computer. That PDF that I just uploaded, I uploaded onto my Zotero installation at work. If I had this synced up, it'll go to the Zotero web account. And then when I open up my laptop, that PDF will be available, and along with any references that I made in my laptop when I open up Zotero from there. So this is great for storing files because are storing information and metadata and references because you have an unlimited amount. And so any changes that I make anywhere, I can add as much as I want to. I don't have to worry about that. It's only when the file storage, you have to start considering the quota that you have and the amount you can actually store. So this is just a different way of looking at the difference between reference storage and file storage. It breaks down what the items are. And really the largest difference is that reference storage is unlimited, as I mentioned, and file storage is quite limited. So far we've been adding files in Zotero as stored files. You've actually been putting the copy of a PDF within Zotero. These stored files, that's the default method of storing in Zotero. But, and if you use this in conjunction with file syncing, like I said, Zotero will automatically sync those files between the different installations that you have. Now, you will hit that 300 megabyte limit soon, and you have a couple of options. One, you can purchase more storage for an annual fee. Another way of doing that is not to turn on syncing in the first place. So in other words, all your references and all your files will only live on the single implementation of Zotero that you have installed. Now, what you're doing is you're cutting off a lot of the useful features that Zotero makes available to you. So you won't be able to automatically sync between your computers. You won't be able to access your web library. Zotero keeps a copy of your library on the web. So if you're at a computer terminal, let's say at NYPL, and you want to see what you have in your library, you won't know because you don't have that. And you won't be able to use any collaborative features. So group libraries, you can see I have a few right here. You don't have access to that because group libraries requires syncing in order for them to work. But that doesn't mean that this isn't a compelling option. If you're the type of person who may work only from a laptop or from a single computer, and you want to use that just exclusively for your research, you really can store your PDFs here as long as you don't turn syncing on. And so let me just show you where that syncing panel information is. If you go to File, or rather Edit, and go to Preferences. This is on a PC. On a Mac, it's slightly different. But if you explore the menu tool, you'll find the references or the preferences there. And you can see that there's a sync panel. And this is where you would sync with the registered username and password that you created if you signed up for one in Zotero. And once you hit that and hit up set up syncing, it'll sync automatically. I had this syncing automatically, but for the purposes of this exercise, I stopped it because I don't want these PDFs to clog my storage or really to download if I had another implementation of Zotero opened. So, I mean, at this point, you really have to evaluate whether, working from one implementation, one version of Zotero is for you. I personally prefer the freedom of using Zotero from any computer I happen to be at. And since I work with my colleagues on shared bibliographies, syncing is really the only option for me. There is another way to work with PDF files in Zotero, and that's a way to access link files. That's another option. So with linked files, Zotero only stores a link to the location of the original file on your computer. Since linked files are not synced, they don't count towards your free storage. URLs, which is basically what it is unlimited. It's considered metadata. So let me show you what I mean. And in order to do so, I'm going to go ahead and delete these references. And let me empty my trash so that way nothing gets confused. So I can go to the Add button, and instead of going store copy of a file, I can store a link to the file. And for now, I'm going to store, so I'm connected to, in this case, I want to connect to Box, which is my cloud-based service. And I have a copy of that folder here. There it goes. Great, so it was able to read that embedded metadata. And notice that instead of having the PDF here, there's actually a link. So if I needed to ever consult this PDF, as long as that link is active, it'll open up the PDF copy of the PDF. And if I was syncing and I had access to the cloud-based network, I'd also be able to access this from my laptop. I happen to have access to this network from my laptop, so this would be an option for me if I wanted to store PDFs this way. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if this link ever changes, the location ever changes, the link itself won't change, and so you'll get an error. Let me demonstrate what I mean by that. I'm going to go ahead and take this and cut it. Oh, let me just delete it. I have a copy. And if I try to access it again, oh, that should not happen. That is the first time it's ever happened, folks. I'm a little bit chagrined, actually. Make sure I deleted that. Delete. Yes, it was still there. There you go. So this is what you should see. So the attached file can't be found at the following path. So if you move a file, if it gets deleted, if it changes, that link attachment won't work. You should also know that link files cannot be added to group libraries because there's no method to ensure that all members of a group would have access to that link itself. You'd still be able to use it as a reference in a group library. So that's something to consider. I'm going to go, when I share the slide deck, and the slide deck will be shared with you by next week, I'm going to have this link here that talks about attaching files because you can use, as the question was mentioned earlier before the session began, on cloud storage, on using Google Drive. You can use Google Drive to attach links to files that way. But because everybody's implementation of Drive may be different, and their own personal research needs may be different, rather than go through every possible permutation, I'm just going to include the link so that way you can go straight to the support pages for that. So just know that those are some considerations in terms of storing actual PDFs on there. In my personal opinion, I use Zotero simply as a way to generate citations and bibliographies, as a way to keep track of references, and as a way to really use it for dynamic deep bookmarking. So I bookmark, journals that are relevant to me, things that I find interesting, because I can use that unlimited. I don't want to have to concern myself with storage quotas or anything like that. And I can just have other options for actually storing the PDFs that I need. But Zotero does offer that option if that's something that you're interested in. So now that we've talked about how to add files into your library and how to add references to your library, we're going to touch again on organizing the references and files that you have. Then we'll demonstrate how to organize your library utilizing collections and tags. We'll show you a little bit more deep dive into notes. And then we'll end up covering searching, sorting, and exporting or creating reports from your references. So let's review collections and tags, because these are the two primary ways of organizing information in your Zotero library. So let's talk about tags first. The first thing you do is you assign tags to references to help you find the materials later on. So you can see I have quite a lot of references. This is not as many as I had last session. I pared it down a bit just for today's example. But you may have thousands of references in your library. For example, I can show you. Oh, this won't load up because I no longer am syncing. That's right. Just know that you can have thousands of references in your library. So tags really help you by assigning this, because it allows you to assign the same tag to different references, which will show up in the library pane when you click on them. So for example, I have a tag called catalog resumes, which should bring up those Caravaggio catalog resumes, and it does. Notice that there aren't any other tags highlighted right now. They're all in gray. That's because these do not have those tags on them. If I want to see everything in my library, I just click it again, and my library comes back up. We assigned the tags through the connector, but you can assign the tags once you get the item in here. So for example, here, I can click a tag, and let's say I add the chapter, a new tag called chapter 3. Say I'm working on for my thesis. And maybe 2 of these works get a tag called chapter 3. And now if I just click on chapter 3, I can get the references that are tagged. And catalog resumes is also tagged because, or highlighted in dark black, because they are tags within these references as well. Again, I mentioned that Zotero automatically assigns tags based on subject headings from references. I don't find these particularly useful, so I have them turned off automatically, but I believe by default they're turned on. So let me show you what that looks like when they're turned on. You can see I have a few more that popped up. I turn them on by clicking on this panel at the bottom corner and then show automatic. So I have 2 different types of catalog resumes, but I don't know if everything that I need is tagged as a catalog resume. I actually have 3 different versions of catalog resumes, which is why I prefer assigning tags myself rather than relying on automatic tags. So I'm gonna not show automatic, and I'm actually gonna click on delete automatic tags in this library. And it's gonna tell me that this action can't be undone. This is a personal preference. I don't use automatic tags. I don't like them. You may find them useful for yourself, but just know that those options exist. The other way that Zotero organizes material is through collections. You can see I have a few right here. You can have multiple collections in a library, and you could have the same reference in multiple collections. So let's see what that looks like. So I can, for example, if I right-click, click on New Collection, I can create a collection called Caravaggio. And there's nothing in it right now. If I go to my library, I can put all the collections or references that I added. And I'm just gonna click on the first one, hold Shift, click on this one, and then just drag the entire library to Caravaggio. Once I see the little plus sign next to my arrow, I know it's gonna go in here. And it looks like nothing happened, but you may recall that I said that references act like songs in a playlist. So all your references live in your library, but you can put them in multiple collections. So they're here. I have the chapter 3 references that I've limited within this collection. And maybe I want to add those references to a new subcollection called chapter 3 within my thesis. So I'm going to click on my thesis, right click, and go to new subcollection and say chapter 3. Now I can click and drag these references also to chapter 3. So now they're here and they're here. And they're also in my library because that's where they're actually at, which is a nice tool. So why choose collections over tags? There's really not one benefit over one versus the other. It depends on your organizational habits. I use a combination of both, but I tend to be a much more hierarchical person in terms of how I store things. So I like using collections and subcollections, and I'll use tags for certain things that I need, like a to read tag or things related to that. Catalog resumes is a great way to use tags. So now that we know how to organize using collections and tags, let's talk about notes. So notes are a tool that can add context to items in your Zotero library, and they're stored in the library and do not count towards that free storage quota. So please make as many as you want. They come in two types, standalone notes and child notes. Standalone notes live within a collection or within your library, and child notes live within the actual references themselves. So the standalone notes add context about a collection, or they can act as a reminder. And then you can use child notes for context about a specific item. And let me show you how those work real quick. So if I wanted to add a standalone note to this Caravaggio collection, if I just go to new note, new standalone note, I get taken to a little word processor page right here on the right, and I can put if I wanted to edit this in a separate window, I just hit edit in a separate window. And I actually have this popped out and I can kind of write long form. You can put bullet points, you can put references to other works, which we'll talk about in a minute, and all sorts of different formatting options for your notes. Notes can also be ordered. So if I put one dot and then decide to create a new standalone note, and then a new standalone note, well, they normally come ordered. My version of Zotero is acting funky. Let me try it within a child note. So if I wanted to add a child note, let's do that here. There we go. I accidentally took it out and put it as a standalone note, but they will be ordered. And so let's say I wanted to add one more note. I can call this 1.1. As you can see, it automatically goes underneath the 1.0 note. So this is a great way for forming outlines. In fact, you can even do something like create a new subcollection called my outline, and then start to have a bunch of notes within here that refer to references in your books or into your chapters. Now the question becomes, how do you know what note refers to what book? One way of doing that is through related items. So let me just create a note and we'll just say, and if you look down here, there's this related button. If I click on that, it'll open up a mini version of my library. And I can point to another reference within the library. Here's the Graham-Dixon book. If I didn't know where this was, I can click on my library and then just search. There you go. Now I know it's related. And so when I go back here and go to, well, now I don't see the book. There it is. And go to related, I see that there's something else. And if I click on that, I get taken back to the note. Which brings me to my next topic, related items. You can relate items not only just from note to item, but also item to item. So this is a third method of organizing in Zotero, and it really sets up relationships between any pairs of items in a library. And this can be useful for many reasons. You may want to connect a book chapter to their parent volumes. You may want to connect different versions of a single work. So if you're working with multiple editions of a work that may have some changes, you might want to create those relations. You can link associated items from different collections, like I did with that outline, to the actual item. One way that I think is really neat is linking book reviews to the actual book. So if I go back here, and I have an empty collection called book reviews, I'm just going to highlight it and find a book review. Okay, guess what? I have one saved already. Saving it. And I already have the book. Actually, I did not save the book, so let's go ahead and save that now. The book is called The Lost Painting. Let's save it here. If I go to related, I can click on add. And now any notes that I make on one reference or the other, I'll know that there's some sort of relation between the two. And that's a neat little way that Zotero offers you to organize materials. This is not a feature that I use very often, but it is another good way of organizing things if that's the type of mindset you have. So we covered searching briefly. I'll look at it a little bit more. So you can search within most any field within your Zotero library. Like I said, sometimes this can be a little bit overwhelming and you just want to see things, for example, related to chapter 3, and it brings that up. Notice it says all fields and tags right here. So that's what I have it set up. If you click on this drop-down arrow, you can change it just to title, creator, and year, or everything. If you click it to everything, it can slow down the search, especially if you have a lot of references to search through. So it's better just to pick one or the other here. But I think when you're just getting started and you have very few references, everything works quite fine. Once you get even more references, you may want to do some advanced searches. So if you click on this search button right here, you'll be taken to the advanced search options, and it gives you some more dynamic fields to search from, including saving your searches as well. One other aspect about Zotero and searching is the lookup feature. So let's say we have this item right here, and I don't remember what library it's from, or let's say I'm not in New York at the moment, and I need to find another library. If I hit this arrow button right here, I can go to the library lookup, and it'll search WorldCat, and I can see other items that might have it, or at least I get a version of the WorldCat record. This particular record isn't as thorough as it could be, but now this is where I can begin searching. And this menu is dynamic, so it'll change depending on the item. So for example, here, I can view the snapshot, I can view this online, I can show the file, or I can try a library lookup as well. And then you can also change the library lookup option to match a library of your choice. So if you work exclusively in one particular library, NYPL, or your academic institution, you can change this using an open URL resolver. How to change this? Click on Edit, Preferences, Search. It is not search. Oh, here it is, under Advanced, excuse me. So I can just type in my URL right here. Right now I have it set, and by default it's set to WorldCat. This slide and this link will take you to a list of compatible open URL resolvers. So instead of having to ask your librarian If they're not available, you can just click on this link and see if your institution supports the Zotero library lookup feature. Sorting is another good feature, especially if you tend to work exclusively within your library. As you can see, I have 3 fields that I can sort from: title, creator, date added. If I click on this button right here, I can add multiple other fields, including extras, notes, other columns that might be relevant. So I can click on like item type, for example, and I can sort things by type. Just moving this will change this around. I like the date added feature because I like to see what I added today, especially for an example like now, when I know all of these things that are relevant for today's exercise, but not necessarily for my personal research. I can just click on date added, see them, and then take them to the trash. So that's how you get multiple fields, year, publisher, here that you can sort from. The view button is also something we're going to cover quite quickly. As you notice, and I mentioned before, items in your collections are non-recursive. That means things that are in subcollections aren't reflected in the parent collection. So you see I have the lost painting reference here, but it's not in my thesis. There's 2 ways that you can go about that. You can drag this to my thesis in which it'll show up. I'm going to go ahead and right click and remove it from the collection. And let me just mention this. If I right click and click remove from the collection, it removes the reference from the collection, but not from my library. If I click move item to trash, it actually removes it from my library, and it removes it from any other collection that I may have the item in. So be careful when you're editing or making adjustments that you pick the correct option for what you want to do. So that's still here, but it's no longer here. If I go to view, I can have the option to show items from subcollections. Clicking on that will show all the items from subcollections. It takes a second to reload. But now you can see, including notes from the subcollections here. So depending on what you like to see, this may be of use for you. I personally like to only see what I put in my collections. And then here's where you also change the layout, the font size. I should probably start with making it bigger in the first place now that I'm using this. And note font size as well. So we're going to look at the 4 different collections that are on the right side that we haven't talked about yet. The first one is My Publications. So the My Publications collection is where you would want to store a list of your own work that you want to share on your Zotero profile page. So there's a couple of qualifiers here. A, you need to be syncing, so you need to have a Zotero account. They're free, but you need to have all of that linked up. Also, the PDFs that you share, you should have the license and rights to share them. So keep that in mind. Only add work that you have created yourself and that you can distribute freely. The duplicate items will show up when you have more than one of the same reference. So this is helpful for organizing. So if I can save this to my library, save it again, I'll refresh the page. I have it here, but of course, after I add another 100 references, I won't realize that I have it twice. I periodically check the duplicates items and see what I have. Unfiled items are materials that aren't in any collection, but are living in your library. So if you're going through here and you're just looking for material and you can't find it, sometimes check the unfiled items. It's just a smaller version of your library of materials that you haven't yet assigned to a collection. And finally, the trash is the temporary storing location for all materials that you have decided aren't useful to you. So by default, the trash can only be emptied by you manually. So you have to right click and empty trash. But if under the preferences, you can set that to automatically remove items in the trash that are more than a certain day old. So if you never want that, just make items from trash to be deleted. Just be sure and confirm that that's a 0. If you're okay with like 10 days ago, that's fine as well. And I also want to note that, as I mentioned earlier, Zotero automatically attempts to pull snapshots or create snapshots and pulls PDFs from those references that you want to save. If that's not something you want to do and you're more like me and you just want to use this as a citation and bibliography manager, under General, you can turn the feature automatically take snapshots when creating items from web pages off, and automatically attach associated PDFs with other files when saving items. Turning those two off will make sure that you don't, that you only put in things that you want, files that you need. The last thing I want to hit on is on reports. Zotero does offer the option to generate reports from materials within your library. This is great if you're downloading a large number of materials for, say, a literature review, and you put them in one particular collection. If you right-click, generate report from a collection, it'll create a nice printable document that you can then look at. So you can see that I have tags, any notes that I have available are here. Any related materials are noticed. So this is great if you want to print out something for a literature review, for example. You can actually modify this feature to export a batch of notes as an outline. So let's say I had 15 notes here as an outline. Zotero offers you the option to change how reports work to actually print out a dynamic outline. That does involve going through some hidden features that Zotero has. It's not a difficult thing to do, but it's also not in the scope of the session that we have here. So I've just included the link for you to access if that's something you decide you want to explore. So that's it for today's session. Looking ahead, next week we'll talk about bibliographies and citations, including changing styles, going deep into the citation editor, and talk about manually editing materials. And our last session on July 30th, we'll cover more about syncing and collaboration, including creating group libraries and how to customize those libraries. There's a list of resources that you will receive when you get this slide deck sent to you. I want to thank you for your time. You can always reach me at this address and reach any of our librarians here. And I just want to mention another thanks to the NEH for sponsoring this virtual program. And just to note that any views, findings or conclusions or recommendations expressed in these programs don't necessarily reflect those of the National Endowment for the Humanities.